Hi, welcome to Vision Chats, where the only thing that matters is the future. My name is Zane Forshee. I'm the director of LaunchPad here at the Peabody Institute of Johns Hopkins University. I'm also on the guitar faculty. And it is my incredible pleasure to welcome Jeff Z, CEO at the Element Group, to talk today about the future of music and recorded sound. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. I'm going to put the tape playing the guitar down.
You sounded great.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with just kind of big picture. Talk about, if you could, based on the you have a tremendous experience working in the industry. If you could just start with what you saw pre-pandemic in terms of the trends of music, physical copies in terms of like CDs, LPs. The rise and return of the cassette tape in some instances, and merch, and then what happened with the streaming and how you're seeing that start to impact today in this kind of COVID world.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I will say that before the pandemic, we were seeing a rise again in vinyl. I know I was somebody that was out there and going and purchasing as much vinyl as I possibly could, calling my label friends and trying to get them to send me that instead of stacks of cassettes. But it was really, really interesting. You know, streaming has been on a rise for so long now, and coming from the terrestrial radio world where I was for 12 years, I saw a real switch going from, radio to streaming. God, for me, it was about 9 years ago. And then it just continued to grow. And when I went to Pandora, we were one of the few in the field. So we were battling mainly against terrestrial radio, which was where most people were really learning about new music. Radio will forever, and still to this day, be known as the place that breaks artists. When you talk to an artist like The Weeknd, they want to be number one on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. They want to be number one on MediaBase. And both of those things are highly affected by terrestrial radio. So as you start to see CD sales start to drop off for everybody except for Adele, it started to really show a really high impact on the streaming space. And that was where, that was what intrigued me to get into this space and really start to figure out what was next, where were people discovering new music.
So you mentioned that the power of radio in kind of shaping and kind of breaking an artist. Can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing artists break today? Is it still in radio, or is it more in digital, or what are some of the things that you're starting to see happen and change?
It's a lot more in digital, and it's not just in streaming. Everything goes in phases. It went from terrestrial radio to all of a sudden streaming started to come into play. And during that whole time, there was always the middle phase of YouTube, which was very video-based, which was put a little bit more of a face to an artist. So an artist was going to their label, and their label was still checking the box of terrestrial radio because over 100 million people still discover music from terrestrial radio. And then they started to see, platforms like Pandora and Spotify and Apple and Amazon really start to take shape and start to pull an audience. And what you noticed on the streaming world was people were paying for music. And when somebody's paying for music, they're much more engaged with what's going on. So a lot more people that were paying for music was where they were being targeted now for concert tickets. So if you're paying for music, you're probably somebody that's going to pay to go see an artist. So these labels and these management teams started to really try to figure out ways to merge what they were doing on a promotional side for streaming services to how they were going to get people to bounce concert. And that was where everything started to really move. Radio is it's controversial as to say, will a 12 to 24-year-old ever listen to terrestrial radio again? To me, I don't think it'll ever make its way back, because when I get in the car, my phone automatically goes on to whatever the last streaming service was that I was using, and I don't have to even think of what platform I'm using. Almost to the point where I could say, Siri, play me the new Luke Combs album. And I don't have to do anything else. I don't have to stop. I don't have to look down. I can continue to drive, and I can get the music that I want. So that has always been a game changer. What you're seeing now is the surge in TikTok. in gaming companies. Where kids are discovering music is it's all right here. Everything is here. You don't need anything but that. And that is what's getting really, really scary to a lot of streaming spaces. You have TikTok and platforms like that are becoming the next discovery platforms. But what's also being noticed with that world is people are in and out of music very, very quickly. Somebody that's discovered Olivia Rodrigo on TikTok did it 3 years ago. Olivia Rodrigo is probably going to be one of the big winners at the next up and coming award shows because this is her time to most of the world. But I have 12-year-old twins at home, and my daughter's on and off Olivia already. There's 6 or 7 new ones that have come up to her that she's already discovering. So it's all in your hands, discovery right now.
So that's fascinating, and I agree that this really is the kind of the game-changing device for all of us, because in a sense, like, you can choose all kinds of things and explore in different ways. One of the things that you mentioned with Olivia is, and with like TikTok, is like the cycle is in a sense faster for an artist, and I'm wondering if you could kind of break down a little bit the like pre-digital streaming, like what the typical life cycle of an artist was, and like an early artist, and how that's changing now.
So pre-digital, an artist was usually being signed to a label before most people were doing it. A label and a management team would take an artist, they'd get signed to a label, and then the label would build out a EP or a long album. And that would be the body of work that artist would then be shared to the world with. Now, an artist is being played on TikTok without having any background whatsoever of a label or a management team, and then the label and the management team is going and trying to sign them. So for the most part, there's millions of people who have now already heard this artist, became fans of them, and then the battle comes on for the label to either have an artist signed to them or an artist to stay independent. So a lot of the way things used to work was it was very regimented. He discovered, signed to a label, build your album, put music out on radio, tour. Now it's put your music out, millions of people have found you, labels are coming after you. You can either now sign to a label, put out an EP, or you can just continue to put out singles. There's artists that will never put out an album again because there's no need to, and the expense that they have to do that doesn't really work for them in the structure of how they put out music.
That's fascinating and exciting in some ways, because it feels like in the early model, the pre-streaming model, there's in a sense a traditional path, and we've now kind of knocked that down with the advent of technology. What are some of the challenges you're seeing with artists in this new format? Because it's in a sense like anyone with a phone and an ability to record can start putting their own work out. What are some of the challenges around that?
The challenges are there's many more artists out there and many more places to be discovered. So it's very fragmented. Again, go back to the days of terrestrial radio, and I don't know what type of music you're into or what you like, but there's probably a specific location for years that you would go to discover music. That one location that you probably went to is now fragmented across probably 10 or 15 different. So each one of those places that you're going to, you may be discovering a different artist in every single one of those. Which now, I ask my children, what's your favorite artist? And they don't have a favorite artist, they have a favorite song. And that favorite song is different 2 weeks from now, 2 weeks from now. So the idea of being able to break out and be an artist instead of just being a song is a lot more difficult now than it ever was because of all the different outlets.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, so as an artist is kind of coming to grips with that, and this idea of this, like, I'm going to put out a song and then another song, and then I've got to keep churning out material. Are you seeing kind of a pattern of are you seeing longevity for some of these artists, or is it just like, are they kind of just coming up and then go and disappearing, or do you see it as they pop up, go away, come back? Like what's some of the stuff you're seeing with that?
That's a good question. It's a little bit of every one of those. You know, artists that are having longevity. I mean, we'll go back to an Olivia Rodrigo. Olivia is an artist that, for some reason, has stayed around a lot longer than some of the other artists that were coming up at the exact same time as her. And I think it's because kids were really able to relate to her. You know, she seemed like that girl next door, you know, the one that just hung out with other girls of her age. So it was very easily and readily available to become a fan of hers. But while Olivia was growing, I can name 15 to 20 other artists that millions of dollars were spent on in marketing across multiple different record labels that never were successful. Now, one of those artists was Doja Cat at the time. At the time, there was a lot of money being put into Doja, and she had great songs. If you go back and listen to her earlier work, really some good music. But it took a minute for her to be discovered. And once she was discovered, now she's on a trajectory now where she's an artist that works on terrestrial radio, works in streaming, has some syncs that she has going on now that take her to the next level. She's working on a deal with a food chain, as with all the rest of the artists are right now. So I think there's few artists that are going to grow out of this. There's millions of artists that are going to be discovered quickly in this.
And it's a really interesting point that you just brought up that I've started to notice and really be curious about, is that, you know, when I was coming up, the artists that I was really looking at, like, they did one thing, and it was like, I make a recording, I'm going to see them at a show, I'm going to buy their T-shirt if they have a T-shirt. Now, as you just mentioned with Doja Cat, I'm on streaming, I've got all these different ways you can go experience my work, and then I'm diversifying into like other spaces. And the one you just mentioned was syncing. Can you talk about what that means when you're talking about syncing?
So if everybody goes back to the early days of Grey's Anatomy, How to Save a Life by The Fray was one of the bigger songs that ever came out of it. So a sync is when a song is inserted into a show in a specific location. So that specific scene, that song played. I think that song actually had an extended version that played almost across the entire episode. Grey's Anatomy, we were also lucky. And now syncing is across everything. So there's not a lot of television that you'll watch, whether it's on Netflix or whether it's on whatever service or device you're using, that doesn't have music playing in the background. That is called a sync. So a sync is something that's set specifically to a specific scene. It could happen in a game. If you're playing a video game and you're in that video game, you walk into a location, and in that location, they're playing, I don't know, We Are the Champions in the background. That is specific to that game at that specific time. That's called a sync. So there's different ways now that artists are being discovered, much more aligned to where kids are. Again, I'll go back. I have 12-year-old twins. My daughter, TikTok all day, every day. My son is on Xbox and video games, and he plays Madden and he plays FIFA. And the minute you go on those games, there's different songs that play. They're not specific, and you can't choose that song if you beat somebody. So that's a little bit different. That's not specifically a sync. That is where you're trying to get your music played almost as a promotional platform, so that kids will hear it, because you got to go to where they're at right now.
So as you think about artists these days, are they thinking about, are you noticing them kind of thinking, hey, I want to get this to be a song on TikTok, but I also want this, I want a song in Madden? Is that some of the goals you're hearing these artists kind of progress and think towards, or is that something that's happening more on the back end in a strategic way?
It matters where an artist is growing from. If there's an artist that their whole life is on TikTok, their goal is to be heard on TikTok. It's just like the old ways of terrestrial radio. I remember all the videos of artists the first time that they heard themselves on their radio station, or getting that phone call from somebody when I was a program director and saying, oh my God, you just played my song. It was the first time I ever heard it on terrestrial radio. Thank you. Now it's, if I'm a fan of TikTok, I want my song to be played on TikTok. If I'm a gamer, I want my music to be played in video games. So again, it goes back to that fragmentation that we were talking about before, of you're discovering and you're becoming an artist based on what your preferences are. Where do you want to be heard? How do you want to be heard? Then it's up to your manager and up to your team to extend that and to build that into a larger opportunity. Be really highly effective.
So a lot of the work I do here at Peabody is training artists to kind of get ready for exiting. You know, they've become good at their craft, and now they're going to kind of start going out. And what I see a lot of is interest and at times resistance towards building on the digital platforms in terms of like the use of the internet. And I'm curious, do you think it's possible these days to build a career that's with minimal impact on the internet, or do you think that really is kind of, in a sense, the way forward for most performing artists?
You know, it's interesting because I could see why they wouldn't want it, because they do think that it's a little throwaway. It's a little, you know, there was a lot of artists back in the day didn't want to become a radio artist because they felt that they were selling out. You know, they don't want to become a digital artist now because they either think they're selling out or they think it's going to shorten their longevity. I'm of the belief that everywhere that you can be exposed is valuable to you. You're never going to shy away from who you are or change who you are, ideally, because of where you're being exposed. But you may gain new fans that are only going to discover you on gaming platforms, or only going to discover you on TikTok. And, you know, those could turn out to be your long-term fans. So I wouldn't shorten my exposure at any time to any place. Doesn't make any sense.
Sure. One of the things I talk about with students is that the internet can be, in a sense, like you're building a digital ecosystem. And I'm wondering if you're seeing a similar thing. You know, in the classical music world, it's a very, you want to talk about fragmented. It's about as small and fragmented as you can get in some ways, because then there's like niches within that. I'm curious what you think is the way forward in terms of like how are you seeing like that ecosystem built for artists to build a sustainable kind of career?
Everybody kind of builds it on their own. You know, there's no blueprint right now. There's nobody can turn to you and say, I can tell you exactly how to get maximum exposure, no matter what you're into. I just worked on a game called Battlefield, and we did a score with an orchestra. I worked with Steve Schnurr. Steve Schnurr is the head of global music for Electronic Arts. He's out of Nashville. He built out this incredible orchestra and had them score the entire game. We were hoping that we were going to get very close to a Grammy nomination, but the Grammys have still yet to realize that gaming is a specific division that needs to be thought of. That's a whole nother conversation. But there's many different ways that you can be discovered. You can't, again, don't shy away from anything, and don't look for a blueprint, because if you're in classical, I don't know exactly how to tell you to do it. If you're in pop, I don't necessarily know how to tell you to do it. There's no blueprint. There used to be find a manager, hope that manager has another successful artist and they can bring you along onto one of those tours, and then sign to a record label. And then sign your life away to a record label, get an upfront payment, and then hope that you're able to recoup. But those days are gone. Well,
that's really that resonates with me. And the one thing I wanted to also ask about is, you know, there's been so much discussion publicly as well as privately around streaming and royalties off of that, and like artists getting paid. And I'm curious, you know, I put out a record right before the pandemic hit, and we had a lot of success with it in terms of like digital streaming, and I got the check off the back end of that, and you know, it's not the same as selling physical copies. And I'm just curious is where you see that going, because as you said, there's no blueprint. So how are you seeing artists build like some sustainability in terms of like where's the money for most of them now, where you see that kind of heading?
It's interesting because you're seeing, obviously you were making money initially selling the CD or selling the actual physical copy. Then you started to see these big numbers pop up that people were making on streaming platforms. Those big numbers were really only the top 0.5%, 1%. But you would get, oh, The Weeknd made $6 million in 2019 in Spotify alone. What they weren't talking about was the other 99.9% of the platform were only making less than $50,000 a piece. And it's difficult. You know, I was involved early on with the licensing deals that we did for Pandora. And, you know, you're building it from a blank slate. The platform itself had, when I was at Pandora, we had about 1,700 employees. So you had everybody from salespeople to people that were involved in music to people that were building the platform and so on and so forth. Every single one of those employees were getting paid based on a product that was being sold. What's interesting for streaming is that product, you don't own it. So it's not like you're building a doll and then you're selling that doll and you're reaping the benefits of every single cent that comes back from selling it. You basically built a platform with a product that you don't own. So how do you split that so that you can continue to be a successful platform, making money, but you're also paying the creators that are keeping your platform alive? And I will tell you that that's one of those situations that I don't ever want to be responsible for, is trying to figure out those splits, because we thought we had it down. You know, Pandora, for years, we were giving 48% of our entire revenue was going back to the creators. If that number went to 55, we would still be having people ask, why is the other 45% going to Pandora? Now, again, if I'm Hasbro and I'm selling a doll, I'm keeping 98%. So, you know, it's such a different world and it's such a difficult place to be in, because that creator is not just Bruno Mars. That creator is every artist that worked on that Bruno Mars album, every writer that wrote that album, every musician that performed, that person that walked in on a Wednesday because they needed somebody to just play a bass in the background on one specific song. He needs to be paid. So there's a lot of hands out for a very small amount of money. And I, for one, definitely think that the money going to the creators is not large enough. But how do you break a percentage so that the platform can continue the sustainability that they need, and you're paying the artist the value of what they really bring to the table?
Yeah, I completely understand, and it's fascinating to me also, as we've watched in pop where there's more collaborative performances. That was one of the first things I thought about. I'm like, you know, it makes total sense in terms of like from an artistic strategy standpoint of like, hey, I'm going to collaborate with this other great artist and we're going to merge audiences and we're going to get more listeners. The challenge though becomes, you know, it's already like a narrow margin. It's like how do you like thread that needle?
And it does seem that the ultimate goal right now, again, is going back to touring. You know, ultimately, you make the most money from touring. You make the most money from brand partnerships. So if you own your own name and likeness, which is now being challenged by some of the major labels to come in and buy your own name and likeness, buy the name and likeness of the artist, there's a lot of different, you know, there's a lot of hands out. And when you're an artist and you sign a deal to a major label and you get that upfront money, that money is going to be recouped. You know, you may receive $2 million and you may think that you just had your big payday. You may not see another dollar from that label partnership for 10 years. So you need to go out and tour. You need to create merchandise. You need to look into how else can you, for lack of a better word, exploit your brand. And how do you create your brand? How do you live behind your brand for, you know, as an artist nowadays?
We've got a thank you. We've got a question from the audience, which is, for classical artists, what is a productive way to approach streaming while also keeping in mind older audiences who may not be on those online platforms? That's the first question.
So for classical artists for streaming, again, there is a lot of scores in a lot of these videos. So the best way to do it is to start to look at who is creating games. I'm sure that every single person can look left or right, and within 2-3 people find somebody that's or has been playing games. Epic Games and Electronic Arts and Activision, those are some of the bigger companies out there right now. Every one of them have probably about a half a dozen people that work in their music. And their goal is to find new music, find it before it's being played anywhere else, discover it, and share it. So you can definitely reach out that way. And then are CDs and other physical forms of music still a productive investment?
Yeah.
I am going to be the person to say no, but that can easily be challenged. I think there's discovery, and for Pandora, our audience when I was at Pandora was 35 plus, and we had a sweet spot of 65 plus because Pandora was such an easy platform. Type in an artist you love, put your phone in your back pocket, and listen to it. Now, I'm sure if you wanted to listen to it around the house, an older audience probably has somebody that was helping them set that up, or they were just becoming very technically savvy to understand how to use it. But, you got to do, like I said in the beginning, don't narrow down your discovery option. Be everywhere that you could possibly be and start to look into different ways to be discovered.
I completely agree. I think it's really just around wherever somebody can find an entry point into discovering who you are. One thing I'm thinking about that you touched on a moment ago was the Grammy piece. And as we're watching all of this happen, because everything's kind of in flux right now, do you feel or do you see that those organizations are they with the times? Are they behind the times? Are they in transition too? What are you starting to notice with things like Billboard and Grammy?
The Grammy committee is definitely in transition. The leadership has recently changed. Harvey just recently took over and brought in some new blood across the leadership side of the Grammy organization. But if you think of Grammy voters, most people that are voting for Grammys have been voting for Grammys for 8+ years. You get new members every year, but it's a very small amount. So I don't know if you're a Grammy voter yourself, but you'll look at. I love getting that form that you fill out to vote, and I look at it, and there's certain times that I will look and say, oh, I know this artist. I don't know any of these other artists. I'm gonna check that.
Yeah.
You don't have the opportunity to listen to every single artist in every single category. What I'm doing is probably the worst thing that a Grammy committee member could do, is going by that artist that I know the name of. This year, ABBA, I think, is nominated for Album of the Year. But ABBA sold less than 100,000 copies of that album. Their streaming numbers are in the tank. So you have an artist now that's nominated for a Grammy, mainly because people know the name and respect the name ABBA. There was a lot of great promo that happened prior to the launch of the Grammy nominations this year, and they got that. Hey, we're gonna add you guys into this. Now, that could take away from some other artists because some of those older Grammy committee members may just vote for ABBA because they know the name. So it's an archaic way of nominations being picked, and it's even a more archaic way of actually getting the votes for the Grammy itself. But they're working on making changes. It's going to be a long and tedious process. It's not digital. Sure,
and the ground keeps moving in everything and on this whole world of music. So it's tricky to kind of look to the future, look at where we are, and kind of build a structure that kind of can be flexible with the future.
And it's hard because they're still trying to categorize it. They're still trying to say something is hip hop, something is pop, something is rock. I think that categories nowadays, they're so blended. There's so much music that's crossing genres. An artist, I think it was Brandy Carlisle, put out an amazing album this past year. She's not nominated in country because they felt it wasn't country enough. So, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah.
That's just kind of the way it is right now. And I think that that's reflective of how many people are actually still interested in watching the Grammys from an audience standpoint. Seeing those numbers dramatically drop. People that are interested in it.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. And the other thing I wanted to kind of touch on was like how you mentioned like live performance is really the place for artists to generate income. And I'm wondering, as you're seeing in the vantage point that you've been in, where I know you are working in the digital world, but you're in the live music things at times. Like, how are you seeing those concerts evolve? I mean, what are you noticing in terms of engagement? How are they approaching shows? How are they approaching tours from your perspective? Has it changed?
There's a lot of artists that are spending more money on their tours becoming almost more of a Broadway musical. So you have an artist like a Taylor Swift, when you go see her show, there's multiple set changes, there's multiple costume changes, there's different bands performing in front of the room, back of the room. And for an artist like Taylor and the young demographic of her audience, I think you have to constantly do that, because that audience listens and watches things in 30 and 60-second intervals. Then you have an artist like War on Drugs, who I'm a huge fan of, that'll go and do a performance in New York at Beacon, and they'll never leave the center of the stage. And people will walk out of that show and say, wow, that was one of the most mind-blowing experiences of my life. And people walk out of Taylor Swift and say, that was the greatest concert I've ever seen of my life. So it's really just knowing your audience and what they want, but also giving them something that's a little different, so that every time that they go see you, they're walking out of there and saying it was a better experience than the last time.
That last part you just mentioned about the experience, I feel like that's the thing people, because they can interact with you immediately from their phone, like if they're showing up, yep. It's not just like the concert I experienced at the small club in my 20s. It was like, now it's like I want to feel something. I want to have some sort of transformative experience.
And it's unfortunate that most concerts are watched like this. Everybody's like this, talking on it the entire time. You know, the days of going to a concert and just sitting there and admiring what was on stage, those days are gone. And don't get me wrong, I wish I had my phone at some of the old concerts that I went to of artists that are no longer around. But at the same time, it drives me crazy. And again, I'm not, right in the younger demographic of going to shows, but it drives you crazy when all you see is a bunch of phones. And it's got to be difficult for the artist on stage to look out at an audience. And a lot of times that audience doesn't have an expression on their face because they're sitting here making sure that their phone is getting attention.
Right, and then you have artists like Jack White who are doing those smaller shows where they're like, they give you the little bag and you put your phone in the bag so you're actually present, which is totally fascinating too. One of the other things I'm noticing is like that there is a push and pull, and maybe it's generational. I'm curious what you think around those artists that are like clearly like understanding how the industry works and where it's going, but they're also having these like someone like a Jack White where they're going, oh no, if you're gonna come live, you're gonna be here, and versus like someone like Taylor where there's like capture it, share it. And I'm wondering, do you think it's going to be a bigger divide, or do you think it's going to be something that's just going to be per audience? What do you think?
I think it's going to be per audience. Somebody like Jack White can do that because he's got an established audience. A group like Fish can do that. They have an established audience. But when you're a newer artist, especially if you're in the pop world, I mean, it's very, very difficult in different audiences. You go to a hip hop concert, there's tons of phones and it's loud as can be. You go to a Taylor Swift concert and it's tons of phones. It's loud because it's a younger audience. You go to a Jack White concert and the sound that you're hearing is people singing the words of the songs. So it's just a different audience for different shows. I'm gonna go see for the 5th time Billy Joel at Madison Square Garden. And when you go to a Billy Joel concert, they're singing every single word, and it's a different audience than I'm gonna get when I go see, 2 weeks later, I'm gonna go see Sebastian Maniscalco. And that is gonna be just a ton of people, probably mid to older demographic, holding up their phones and trying to get a minute of a recording. So it's different.
That's true. One of the other things I started to notice, and because I was seeing this, and this is from artists that have been like older artists in the game, but like where they're going to play a full album for an evening. And again, I think that ties to the experience piece. Has that been something you've noticed more of, or has that just been a kind of a fluke thing that you think some artists are doing?
Some artists that have the albums can do it. There's not a lot of artists over the past 5 years that created a body of work that their audience is going to sit through from beginning to end. It's unfortunate. It really is. There is a few artists, like I noticed there's a question here about Taylor. There's artists like Taylor that their album is, from the beginning of their album to the end. It's very old school. It's very, here's a journey of where I want you to go and how I want you to go through that way. And she's been taking chances. And I think when you're at the top of your game, Taylor went through a moment where she was losing respect of her audience and then really gained it back by kind of just sitting back, throwing on a cardigan, and just making new music that was written with some really top level producers. Her and Jack Antonoff working together. If she can work with Jack for the rest of her life, she'll be around and be relevant for the rest of her life. Certain artists are able to kind of transition, and I think some artists are smart and some artists are just going for what's going on at this time.
So I'm curious, I completely, they have to kind of like keep being creative artistically, but they also have to kind of look towards like the longevity of things and keep evolving, which makes me want to kind of dig into this question that's here about, do you think there will be new live performance models? Like, do you think there'll be like a hybrid thing? That was one of the things I was thinking about with this is, as we're kind of dealing with COVID, some folks want to come to a live show. Some want to have a digital experience. They all want to have an experience, though. So I'm curious, are you seeing that kind of future?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, again, we're coming out of a pandemic back into a pandemic. So what's going on right now, hopefully, will not be a year or two young, knock on wood. But while the pandemic, hit us, a lot of new opportunities came out. There's the digital experience of watching a show on a computer, paying $9 and experiencing it. There's platforms like Wave VR that recently did a Justin Bieber concert, and Justin was an emoji. Was a genie. So there's a bunch of different ways that people are performing, but I think for me, it's always going back and seeing that artist up close and personal. I love the idea of how do you see folklore in a stadium? Hopefully you don't. Hopefully Taylor Swift goes and goes back to very small venues and does those performances and does very small amount of them. I mean, seeing Bruce Springsteen perform on Broadway.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
probably one of the most magical experiences that anybody could ever see. Whether you're a Bruce fan or not, seeing an artist like that up close, hearing him breathe heavy in between the songs, and talk to you about the music, has just such a different experience than going and seeing him at Giant Stadium, with thousands of people. Both of them are amazing experiences, and both of them are experiences that people are going to talk about for the rest of their lives. But an artist like Bruce and an artist like Taylor are able to kind of change their performance and the way that they perform based on their locations and what they're trying to bring across.
That makes complete sense to me. And I do think you're right. Like, we want to have these experiences, these different kinds of experiences. It can't all be small, it can't all be big. It's going to have to be this kind of flexibility. And the artists that are the most...
1,000% about NPR Tiny Desk.
Yep.
It's one of my favorite to watch. Certain artists that I've seen do major shows did Tiny Desk and blew it away. So, love that.
I also like how they're doing the ones where they're remote. They're not necessarily there. Robert
Rodrigo did one at a DMV, which makes so much sense. Here's driver's license being done at a DMV. So it's awesome being able to have those opportunities to take your craft and your art and do it where and how you want it to be done. Those weren't the way it was done back in the day. It was, if you're successful, you're trying to get to the biggest arena. You're ultimately trying to perform at a stadium. Now you can go and you can do these, and then you can look and see, oh my God, 30,000 people today watched my performance on Tiny Desk. By the end of the week, you have 8 million people that saw that performance on Tiny Desk. It's just a different way of being exposed, but it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is people are going to discover you in many different locations. So never limit what you want or how you want to be discovered.
Where do you see all of this going 5 to 10 years from now? What are you starting to see as this trends keep, as everything, because everything's speeding up, and where do you see like the real opportunities for artists, individual, for performances, composers, you name it?
Seeing artists start to take control of their brands again. Where an artist had to be an artist, they now have to be a brand. And they've given it so much ownership of who they are and what they were to a label or to a publicist or whatever it may have been. They're now so much more involved. The successful artists are on the phone with their teams. They're creating these experiences. They're owning their brands. They're not just selling out and giving their brand to something that 3 years down the road they're trying to wipe it off of their history. So when you're coming out and you're starting to build your audience, you need to start from day one to be who you want to be 5 years from now. Because people will always go back and see you back then. They'll always go and they're going to look for kinks in the armor at all times. Who was this person? Oh, I don't like her because she loved eating meat. She was wearing fur when she went to Coachella with her old boyfriend. These little crazy things that didn't matter back in the day are so scrutinized right now, and you really pick apart, your audience and change who your audience is or what they really believe in you as an artist. So you really need to make sure that you're honing your craft and at the same time you're creating a brand.
So there's a real awareness of that makes sense. I mean, that you have to kind of think about multiple steps out, not just today. That video you made or that idea or that concept that you went after is going to be looked at for like 10, 20, 30 years.
And hopefully somebody will look back and say, wow, I never heard that version, or I never heard that song. And they become a bigger fan of yours. It doesn't always have to be about the next song you put out. You may wind up putting a song out, somebody goes back and discovers you from 3 years ago. And their favorite song, maybe it's something that you did, in your basement, on a much lesser system or recording device than you're working with now. And that could become what somebody's favorite song is.
Yeah, and I'm curious then, as you're thinking about that, and as I'm thinking about how this all comes together, do you think artists are going to be looking to? Do you think the album is going to kind of go away as we do this, or do you think it's going to be like the long form? I mean, we talked about that a moment ago with Taylor, but do you think it's going to be kind of the single, the EP, like these smaller pieces, or do you think the long game is going to be, or do you think there's always going to be room for the longer, like long form album?
I'd love to turn that around and kind of ask you, because you are a musician, and how you feel about that. My short answer is it's going to be different for every single artist. I think you're not going to be discovered in your long form. You're going to be discovered in very short forms of content. But people will go, and if they fall in love with you, they'll go and research to see what else you have. And that's where the long form album of where you were just trying to finish a project because you had to put 3 albums out in this, in this label deal that you had. Those days, I think, are hopefully going to be done. Where everything that you put out, you can really spend time.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I see the demand is for new. Like it used to be what I experienced early on in my career was you make a thing and people listen to it a lot, and then as the phone evolved and they could find new things, I remember getting like messages like, when are you making a new thing? And so that life cycle, of that process took time. So now it really is, for me, it's a mix. It's smaller things with larger things. What I found fascinating was that somebody might discover me from a 30-second clip and then go listen to that new piece I created or recorded, and then I can check the stats and realize that they're digging into my whole back catalog of stuff. And that's sort of something I never anticipated that they were going. I mean, it makes sense. I would get one album that I would buy, and then I would listen to every other record I could find of that artist. But it's happening in a different way. The other piece for me is really about collaborating with other artists. That's kind of where the real energy is, I find, because classical audiences, at least for what I do with guitar, are interested in new and different kinds of combinations because the way we listen has changed. And I noticed that when I would play like solo concerts, when I could feel them like 20 minutes in going like, I'm playing all these different pieces, but it's the same kind of sound versus kind of doing different kinds of things, which goes more to that point of like as an experience. So you're going to see all these different kinds of things happen within a hour set.
And it's interesting because if you would go right now and create an album, the time it would take you to create that album, and as you're sitting in a studio and saying, oh my God, this is something so new for us, and we really want to try this, by the time that album comes out, what you said was new could be 6 cycles ago. So that's why I think it's so interesting of creating a small piece of work, and then you as an artist and as a musician are constantly listening to other artists and other musicians. And whether you're collaborating with somebody or not, you're discovering new things that you want to bring into what you do. And it may be something that never made sense for your specific genre or your specific form of music that now is so collaborative and so different and such a change that you have to stay up on.
Yeah, and the other part I think that happens is like the unexpected collaborations, because if you're pushing stuff out and you don't always have a clear sense who it's going to hit, you're kind of throwing things out, and then it's somebody reaches out and goes, hey, can I use this for that? Can I sample this in this thing? And those are some of the experiences I've had that I never expected that they were going to, somebody wanted to use it for like 20 seconds of something I recorded in another thing, but it was like, it's a transcription of a keyboard sonata from the Baroque period, and I'm like, I had no idea I am interested in that, but why is getting used in this? Somebody opens a door in a building, it's one of those things that kind of is surprising to me.
And again, it's so interesting to me how genreless an audience really is right now. How they're not, like, I know when I was in school, you had to be a fan of either rock or pop or hip hop, and you rolled with your audience and your friends that were fans of that specific genre. And nowadays, it's so different. It's so interesting. You can kind of perform many different types of music or be a fan of many different types of music, because you're getting so many different influences and bring it into your sound that makes what you're doing so unique compared to that person that walked right next to you that may have heard 6 or 7 different projects that influenced them.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience to you, Jeff. What would be your advice for classical musicians in your view? What are the biggest challenges for classical music in this new scenario that we're kind of talking about right now?
Again, it's discovery, and I think that's going to always be the most difficult lane, for classical musicians, is new discovery and a new audience, trying to attract a new audience. Classical has really been able to survive without having a specific radio platform for it to be discovered. So it's always been discovered by word of mouth or through people that you knew that were fans of what you were fans of. So I think it's really looking into that, who is the audience that is discovering or that are fans of classical music, and what are they doing? There's so much research out there right now for everything. You could look into different platforms and you can find out what is the demographic or what is the makeup of a classical fan on a specific platform. And it may be much different than what it was just 10 years ago. Classical music for studying, that is something that's so fascinating to me and so different, because that person that is studying, listening to classical music, may also be a fan of tons of different genres. So why do they go to classical music for study? What specifically are they going for? Is there more that you can bring to that? some of these sessions that are happening at different schools now, where they have classical musicians that'll come in and they'll do meditation hours. It's so different, it's so new, and it's so exciting, and it's just different ways of being discovered. But you really got to stay on top of what's going on in the world right now, and how people are, again, discovering music.
To that kind of discovery piece, and we talked about this before we hopped on this call, or like one of the things we talked about was like the power of radio and building artists, and that makes me think also about region, because you and I both know that there were like regional artists that were big because of a radio station, and I'm curious, do you think for artists that are not a Taylor Swift or The Weeknd where they're like huge, but we're talking about like the smaller and mid-level artists that are building, do you think there will be a rise of the regional artist again, that kind of like, in an area?
I don't know, because you're being nationally discovered now, you're being discovered worldwide. It's very difficult. I shouldn't say that. Regional Mexican, a genre that specifically came originally out of South America. It started to bubble itself up. It was really big in Texas, and now it's huge in LA, makes sense. But it's also the most listened to Latin genre on Pandora, which blows my mind, because now you have something that has the word regional in it, that is the most listened to non-English speaking music on a specific platform. Now, I don't know the numbers on Spotify or on Amazon or some of the other platforms, but it's just different. I think everybody's looking for something different. If you look at all the artists that have been that are breaking, and you look at some of these artists that again are nominated for Grammys this year, it's such a wide variety of sound, such a wide variety of lyrics. I don't think you have to call it regional as much as it's just something that you're discovering, and it could be from wherever or whatever. Some of the biggest A&R teams in the world right now at some of the major labels are discovering music out of the Philippines. Doesn't mean that these are Filipino artists. It just means that that's an audience, and in the Philippines right now, they're highly into pop music, and a lot of what's going on, and a lot of A&R teams are looking at what's being played there more than any other place in the world. I'm
still, my head's kind of spinning.
Denmark and Sweden for such a long time, and I think that was the resurgence of EDM and the resurgence of dance music, because it was coming out of there. So you're going to always find different places where different countries, and if you look at different countries, and I love going on the Spotify global charts and just playing the top songs from different countries, and you look at like the top songs from Germany, and it may be an artist that's singing in Spanish, or maybe on the top of the French charts, an Italian artist, and so on. I love seeing that. I love seeing cross-pollination in different places.
I'm curious then, are you seeing, as we've had scenes of, and there's been multiple musicians writing books about this in the past. I think of like David Byrne, for example, with like How Music Works, when he was talking about like the rise of like the Talking Heads and CBGB and all of that stuff. As we're seeing the world kind of shift because of COVID, do you think that, are there any pockets of the U.S. that you're starting to see as kind of like hot spots for artists that are collaborating, or is it because of the digital platforms now, the playing field's level, and it's like everything kind of goes now?
No, it's level. Like, I'll go back to one of the projects I mentioned before, War on Drugs. The members of that group never got together for the last album. They were in their hometowns. Projects were passed across, stems were put together, and it was produced in a completely different town than, different location than where all the musicians were. So you're not limited anymore, which is so awesome as well. Like, again, you were talking about collaboration. Imagine how difficult it would have been for you to collaborate with somebody in South Africa that you were a big fan of, or was a big fan of yours, and you have a likeness in sound and interest in music. You would have never been able to do it. Now you can probably have that song done within a week or two by just sending, projects back and forth. That is super interesting. Yeah,
and I'm curious to see how that, as we talked about, like that accessibility, like what starts to, like what new kinds of fusions emerge for that. I do, and curious about also how artists are going to keep thinking about grabbing samples and working with each other on these kinds of pieces. Are there directions that you think we haven't reached yet, or that artists haven't taken enough advantage of as we kind of move forward?
I think what we were just talking about is something that's going to start to really, really grow. Musicians from around the world being able to work together, collaborating with, you may love this banjo player that is in Nashville, and you may be an artist that's in Antarctica, or whatever it may be. And oh my God, you found a way to access this musician. And musicians are a lot more accessible than I think they ever were in the past, because they're all trying to figure out what's going on as well. You can connect with them through their social. Their management teams, for a lot of artists, are accessible by Googling. So the days of you're never able to reach out to the specific artist or get content to a specific artist are starting to fade away, because if you're a true musician or a true artist, you're looking for your next opportunity, or your next sound that you may not know where that's going to come from. So that's like just crazy interesting to me, is you don't know where or who you're going to collaborate with next, and there's no boundary.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how accessible folks are, and what I've found is really interesting is that if done well, and you just reach out to these folks like through DMs, or you can do an email through a colleague that has a slight connection to somebody, because you can build all of these things so someone can quietly explore what you do. It's so fast in terms of how easy it is to collaborate with people. If anything, the hard part is just kind of working out the back end of like who's going to get what and how I'm keeping everybody happy.
Yeah, and there's nothing you can hide. Again, if you want to work with an artist, that artist is going to research you, and you're going to research everything. You don't know what they're going to listen to, or what piece of content they're going to find from you. They may wind up going to your socials first to see who you are. What type of person are you? So that's again why your brand and who you are is so important. The minute you start to.
We've got one more question here before we wrap up. If an artist does not want to put their music online for whatever reason, do they have any chance to be discovered? I have my view of that, but I'm curious what you think.
What do you think?
I think no. I think if you're not online, you don't exist. What about you?
I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't want to be online. You're going to limit your discovery to people around you. And if that's fine, if you want to be somebody that keeps your music very close and intimate to yourself, and that's what excites you, then you do it. You don't have to share your music with everyone. It's your art. It's who you are. If who you are is very intimate and very close, and you want to keep that close to a certain amount of people, that's fine. But if your goal is to become a well-known worldwide musician, then the internet, unfortunately, has to be your friend. And every single possible outlet should be taken advantage of.
I completely agree. Well, Jeff, we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I'm going to close out and wish everyone a great holiday break. Thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Yeah. And remember, the only vision that matters is the one you create. Have a great evening, everybody.